Looks like everybody have their university background.
All right, well, it's 10 a.m., so let us get started quickly. So first of all, welcome everybody to this session on contracts and incentives. And in fact, Happy New Year to everybody, since it's the first time I see many of you for this year. Before we get started, I wanted to remind people, or John Graham wanted us to remind people that next Monday you will receive a survey request, AFA Work Climate Survey. So he's asking everybody to fill out this survey. It's just going to take just a few seconds of your time, and it's going to be greatly useful for the association. So just wanted to remind you of that. Finally, let's get started. So the presenters will have 20 minutes. The discussants will have 15 minutes, and our first presenter is Martin Szydlowski. Martin, you can go ahead and share. Very good.
All right, I'm ready. Okay, so thanks for having us on the program. So this is joint work with Ivan Marinovic on monitoring of career concerns. So in this paper, we think about monitoring and we think about term limits. So monitoring is key in many relationships and arguably one of the most important functions. This is true for boards and CEOs, for managers who monitor workers, for auditors who monitor firms, and so on and so forth. Recently, these relationships have come under increasing scrutiny, and there's been calls to limit their relationship length. So for boards and CEOs, there's a debate around term limits, and multiple countries have imposed term limits on boards of directors. Multiple companies have imposed term limits of CEOs. If you go over to the accounting literature, there's a debate on auditor rotation. So people realize that some firms had their auditors for the last 150 years, and maybe that's not a great idea. And so essentially, people are viewing this long monitoring relationships with a lot of scrutiny, and they want them to be short. So this is the starting point of our paper. So we want to think about why are longer monitoring relationships worse? So in particular, what is it about monitoring that makes us want to constrain the relationship length? So here's what we do more concretely. So we build a dynamic model of monitoring, and here's our two key mechanics. So the monitor has reputational incentives. So contractual incentives are limited, and the monitor has to invest in human capital to be effective. The agent can shirk, and by shirking, he may learn something about the monitor's effectiveness. With these two ingredients, we get a theory of monitoring relationship length and why term limits might be beneficial. So in particular, here's our key result, and here's our key kind of strategic interaction. So in this model, shirking discourages the monitor. So the monitor's ability is unknown, and the monitor must exert effort to maintain this ability. But if the agent gets away with shirking, the monitor learns that she's likely ineffective. And if she concludes she's ineffective, there's no point to maintain an ability that simply isn't there anymore. So in that case, the monitor stops exerting effort and lets whatever's left of her ability decay. So in this model, it's a very natural notion of entrenchment where the agent shirks at the beginning, then he gets away with it, and then the monitor simply gives up and lets the agent do whatever he wants. Now, let's think about how term limits may help here. The agent, of course, understands the game. So he understands that unpunished shirking will discourage the monitor. And now the agent shirks strategically to achieve exactly that. So in other words, in our model, the agent is offering a challenge to the monitor. He's saying, I'm going to misbehave. catch me if you can, and if you don't catch me, we both know you're not very good at your job. Term limits are useful because they lower the benefit of entrenchment in the future. So even if I learn that the monitor is ineffective, if the monitor frequently gets rotated out, then I don't get to entrench myself. And this reduces my value from shirking today. Right? So imposing a deadline on this relationship may reduce shirking at all points in time. So this is a novel value of term limits, and we haven't seen this in the literature so far. Speaking of literature, let me just be extremely brief. I'm skipping a lot of papers, but the two most important ones are Halach and Pratt and Corona and Rondrava. So in Halach and Pratt's paper, there's a principal who can invest in an attention technology, which rewards the agent's effort. So in a way, this is the flip side of monitoring here. However, in their paper, the agent is myopic, so he doesn't anticipate how his actions today affect the principal's actions in the future. And the strategic interactions is the key point of our paper. In Corona and Randava, the agent shirks and by doing so learns about the monitor, but the monitor's skill is fixed. And in particular, the monitor can't invest. So these entrenchment dynamics we just talked about don't arise. All right, let's get to the model. So the setting is in continuous time. And we will lean very heavily on the incomplete contracting literature by assuming that rewards are exogenously fixed, just for simplicity. The agent can choose how much to shirk. So this is ST. And shirking gives a flow benefit B and some unmodeled cost to the firm. So here we assume shirking is bad and we want to prevent it, but we don't want to model the firm side. We just assume there's some high enough cost. So the agent shirks. Here's the role of the monitor. The monitor has to gather evidence of the shirking so that the agent can be punished. So this is similar to the monitoring technology in Piskorski and Westerfield. I'm guessing Mark will talk more about that later. Once the monitor finds evidence, the agent is punished and gets some penalty K, and then the game ends for simplicity. So the agent gets fired. The monitor is one of two types. So he's either good or bad. The good type finds evidence with some Poisson rate, which depends on how much the agent is shirking. And if the agent shirks more, then more evidence arrives. If he uncovers evidence, he gets some fixed reputational reward R. The bad monitor never finds evidence, right? So the bad monitor, he never can punish the agent. This monitoring type is unknown to both monitor and agent. So for example, the monitor's skill might be match specific and the monitor might not know if he can actually effectively find evidence for this particular agent. And so as the game progresses, both the monitor and agent will learn about the monitor's type. So here's how the monitor's monitoring ability works. So in this model, the monitor must keep up to stay effective. And what this means is the following. So the good monitor will stay good if she invests in her ability. If she doesn't invest, she'll become bad at some fixed Poisson rate gamma. And for simplicity, the bad monitor always stays bad. We relax that in the paper, but for now, I'll just keep it here. This investment of the monitor comes at a fixed cost C. Right? So essentially, this is a technology where the monitor continuously needs to invest in her ability, and if she doesn't, her ability will slowly decay and she loses her ability to find evidence. Okay, so both the monitoring and investment decisions here are observable to both parties, but not contractable. So this is borrowed again from the incomplete contracting literature. What we have in mind here is something like per consumption or empire building, right? I know the CEO is going on a suspicious amount of golfing vacations, but unless he violates some rule, there's not much I can do about that. The evidence is verifiable. And once evidence is generated, then we can condition a punishment on the agent's shirking, right? So the entire role of the monitor is to take this unverifiable shirking and make it verified. Okay, here's how learning works. So evidence arrives with some Poisson rate, which depends on the type of the monitor and the belief, which is PT, and the agent's shirking. If evidence arrives, then we know we faced a good monitor and the game ends. If no evidence arrives, then the belief about the monitor drifts downwards. So if the monitor fails to generate evidence, we learn he's likely ineffective. Here's how this works mathematically. So the belief drifts down, and the belief drifts down more the more the agent is shirking. This is exactly the mechanic I've talked about in the introduction. So the more the agent shirks, the more he discourages the monitor about her own type. So the more the agent shirks, the faster the belief drifts down. If the monitor fails to invest, her type decays, and so then the belief also drifts down faster. So this is the second term. Okay, so let's think about how these belief dynamics translate into strategies for the monitor and for the agent. Before we do that, let me just show you the payoffs, just so we're in the clear. These payoffs are very boring. They're pretty much what you'd expect. So tau is the time when evidence is found. The monitor gets a reward. Until that time, he has a cost of investment based on how much investment happens. And the agent gets the private benefit of shirking until he gets caught and punished. So this is all that's happening. Okay, so we focus on Markovian equilibria in this model. And here's how such an equilibrium will look like. The red line is when the agent shirks. So when the belief is high, the agent thinks it's likely the monitor is effective, and then he doesn't want to shirk because he's likely to get caught. When the belief is low, the agent starts shirking. The monitor only works when the belief is intermediate, so it's between PL and PH. In particular, the monitor shirks for high beliefs and also shirks for low beliefs. Why does the monitor shirk for high beliefs? Well, the agent doesn't shirk here, right? So the agent doesn't misbehave, so there's no evidence to generate. And then the monitor can't find a reward. So there's no point for the monitor to stay in this region, and then she lets her ability decay. So in a way, this here is a failure of reputational incentives. When the belief is very low, the monitor concludes that she's already the bad type, and then investing to maintain her ability is not worth it anymore, and then she simply stops. Right? So essentially here, nobody, the monitor shirks and the agent works. Here, the monitor invests and the agent shirks, and here the monitor gives up, and then the agent can shirk and is unlikely to be caught, and the monitor doesn't maintain her skill. So let's think about the dynamics that this kind of equilibrium induces. If we start out in this top region, the monitor shirks, and so the belief drifts down. If we're in this middle region, the monitor works. However, the agent shirks, and again, as long as the agent isn't caught, the belief drifts down as well, until we reach this lower region here, where the agent becomes entrenched and the monitor stops investing in her ability. So in this game, the belief is on path, strictly decreasing, and we always reach this entrenchment region. Importantly, the agent anticipates that by shirking, this entrenchment region will be reached eventually, and this encourages more shirking today. So in particular, in our model, the agent shirks more than a myopic agent would. And so this is kind of just because anticipating this shirking region. Okay, so now it should be pretty clear why term limits are valuable, right? So reaching this entrenchment region is a reward for past shirking, because then I can get the monitor to give up investing in her skill, and I'm very unlikely to be caught. If I now impose a term limit, so I rotate out the monitor for a new one after some deadline, then I can reduce the time the agent spends in the entrenchment region, and that reduces the incentive to shirk in the first place, right? So by imposing a deadline later on, I can reduce shirking weekly, at least at any point in the relationship. So here's the formal statement. So let's replace the monitor with a new one at some threshold belief, which is equivalent to replacing them at some deadline. Then if this belief is sufficiently low, shirking in equilibrium is lower than without a term limit. So just by replacing monitors, I can reduce shirking here. And so this justifies why limiting the relationship length might be beneficial. Importantly, this result continues to hold even if there's a cost of replacing the monitor. Okay, so I got the 5-minute message. So these are the main results. We have a few extensions in the paper that I just want to briefly touch on. So one thing we think about is bribes. So the agent may pay the monitor to hide evidence once evidence is found. And we show that monitors with longer tenures accept bribes. And another extension we have is on organizational design. So we think about what happens when the monitor has to oversee multiple agents, and this induces free riding problems, both either on information or on punishments. So since I have some time left, let me talk about those a little bit more. So here's what happens when we introduce bribes into the model. So now the timeline is as follows. So evidence arrives, and the monitor can decide, do I want to investigate to make this verifiable, or do I just leave it alone and let it go away? The agent can propose a bribe to the monitor to not investigate. And if the monitor accepts the bribe, then the relationship just continues, and we just pretend nothing ever happened. If the monitor rejects the bribe, then the agent is punished and the monitor gets her reward. Right? So the question is now, which types of monitors are being bribed, and when are the agent's bribes going to be successful? So here we find that longer serving monitors are subject to bribes. So essentially, whenever the belief about the monitor is low, so whenever we're convinced that the monitor is ineffective, then bribes will occur. And in the game, this happens sufficiently late. The intuition for this is essentially the relationship value will decrease as the effectiveness of the monitor decreases. And so at some point, just continuing with the relationship is not worth it. So I have 2 minutes. So another extension we think about is what happens when the monitor has to oversee multiple agents. So directors often sit on multiple boards, CEOs oversee multiple managers, and so on and so forth. So what if we extend this game when there's one monitor and multiple agents? Is this beneficial, or should we just try to make sure that each monitor is assigned to one agent? So with multiple agents, we now have a game of strategic experimentation with a bandit, which is about the monitor's effectiveness. And in such games, there's free riding on information generated by others, right? So I might say, I don't want to experiment because somebody else will. And this reduces my incentive to experiment, and everybody experiments less. However, since we have punishments here, there's another effect, And so agents may actually free ride on punishment. So agents may say that if I experiment a lot and everybody gets punished, then other people will bear the burden and then everybody experiments more. So whether or not the monitor should oversee multiple agents now depends on whether I can condition punishments on every agent or whether I can just punish them collectively. And we show that with individual punishments, so when each agent's individual shirking is observable, then it's optimal to have the monitor multiple agents. And with collective punishments, when shirking is not observable, so you can only observe if some agent shirked, but not who did it. In that case, it's not optimal for the monitor to oversee multiple agents, right? So here, kind of, we recover a theory of organizational limits based on observability of evidence. Okay, so let me conclude. Just circling back to the monitoring debate. So there's calls to limit relationships length in monitoring. The counter argument is that monitors remain effective because they have reputational incentives and because they have expertise. Our model has these features, but still monitors become ineffective over time and term limits work. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Martin. This is right on time. So the discussant is Mark Westerfield. And as Mark sets up, I want to remind the audience that you can ask your questions in the Q&A panel. Obviously, the presenters won't be able to answer as they present, but after the fact, they can do that. So in particular, Martin, I think there's a question or two. So we'll do that. And we'll proceed with live questions a little bit later in the presentation so that we don't run out of time. So without further ado, Mark, you've got 15 minutes.
All right, thank you. You can see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. I very much enjoyed reading it, and I'm happy to talk about it. So let me give you my summary of the paper's question and answer, which is similar to Martin's, but with a slightly different emphasis. So I view the question as, why do monitors lose effectiveness over time? And so Martin motivated this in the paper and in his talk with the notion that skills might become obsolete over time. So this is technology changes. There's diversion between what the monitor and the agent are doing, but there's some kind of change over time that makes the monitor's skills obsolete. Second, there might be entrenchment of some kind. So some notion that the monitor or the agent become entrenched and sort of can't exit. And then the primary motivation here is the monitoring duties of boards of directors. So why does that a long-standing relationship kind of not work? The answer in the paper is that the agent does active experimentation and testing. So the agent experiments. If the monitor might be obsolete, the agent has an incentive to test the monitor. And there's a slippery slope. Successful tests lead to worse beliefs about the monitor's ability and more tests. Then you get entrenchment. The reward from success is the ability to shirk more in the future. Now, one thing that's interesting about this model is that the monitor-agent relationship is aggressive. The outcome is either that the agent is detected or realizes they can shirk forever. So in particular, it's not really a prevention model, it's a detection model. And that's an interesting addition. So let me run through a summary of the game with, again, a slightly different emphasis. So there's an agent that can shirk to generate flow benefits B. This is observable but not verifiable. And the agent's flow benefits from shirking come from outside the model. So in particular, the monitor does not pay them. The monitor has a verifiable Poisson detection process with intensity lambda. So every so often when the agent is shirking, you detect them. The monitor can be good or bad. Monitoring is effective or not. If the monitor detects shirking, the monitor gets R and the agent loses K. So payoffs are fixed. This is not an incentive design or an information design game. So it's not a disclosure game or an information or an incentive game. The monitor turns bad at a Poisson rate gamma if they invest or 0 if they don't. Importantly, no one knows the monitor's type, and so there's just a shared belief P. This technology means there's always going to be obsolescence over time without full investment. So the monitor is just trying to avoid sliding down into obsolescence. And then the monitor pays a cost CI when they invest I, and this is observable also. So the agent can see the monitor's investment. Okay. So we get a symmetric information game here. Both sides can see shirking, both sides can see investment. The state variable is P, the beliefs. And the beliefs are just given that the agent has not yet been detected and the known history of investigation and shirking which both sides have. What's the probability the monitor is the good type? Okay. Now, one of the striking things about this paper is the difference you get from thinking about monitor as a game versus incentive design. So let me talk a little bit more about that. So the monitor strategy. The key point about the monitor is that they only get paid if they detect shirking. The monitor does not benefit from preventing shirking. In fact, the opposite. The monitor wants the agent to shirk so that the agent can be detected. Okay? So the monitor prefers to be of medium quality, not too high or too low. Too high, the agent will be detected for sure, and so they won't shirk. Too low, and the agent will shirk and not be detected. The sweet spot is in the middle, where the agent is tempted and might get caught. So they invest to keep their type, P, in the middle. If P is too low, if P is too high, the monitor reduces P through lack of investment. If P is too low, detection is unlikely and investment is useless. So another neat thing here is the complementarity. So the wider the shirking region, the more the monitor, the more the agent shirks, the more the monitor is willing to invest. So that we look at the agent strategy. So the agent wants the monitor to be low quality so that they can shirk forever. Okay? The agent will experiment. They shirk even when the chance of getting caught is a little too high. This is the testing or challenging that Martin mentioned. The benefit is entrenchment. If the monitor doesn't catch them, the agent gains the knowledge there's an opportunity to shirk more in the future. Okay? And there's a slippery slope here. PT moves monotonically down if the agent shirks and is undetected. All the monitor can do with investment is slow this process down. Okay? So notice the complementarity here as well. The wider the range of monitor investment, the higher the agent's incentive to do this experimental shirking. So without the monitor's investment, the agent can just wait. The monitor's type changes in expectation. With monitor investment, experimentation is much more valuable. Okay. Equilibrium is two thresholds, low and high. There's shirking if the belief is below the high threshold, and there's monitor investment when you're in the middle. There's multiple equilibria in the model because you can get different values of pH. Okay. The great benefit of sort of simple models like this one is you can add numerous non-trivial extensions, which the authors do. So they add term limits. Here you can punish the monitor when they have a low P because they get replaced. This just increases investment to avoid that state. You can allow bribes. So the agent can bribe the monitor not to report the detection. The equilibrium structure remains here with low quality monitors accepting bribes, taking the money instead of taking the reward. You can have multiple agents. So, and here, as Martin mentioned, it really depends on whether you can identify who's shirking. Do you identify that it's one person in particular who is shirking, or do you identify that just somebody is shirking? So when you have individual detection, there's free riding on experimentation. So if I'm an agent and Simon is an agent and I see Simon experiment, I get the information that the monitor is probably the low type. We free ride, and so there's less shirking. On the other hand, if we have collective punishment, now every time Simon shirks, he puts me at risk of punishment. So I had better shirk now if I'm going to get any benefits out of this. So we shirk earlier. Okay. You can add wages. So the authors add wages. So for the monitor based on P. So given this public belief, the monitor can be paid. Okay. If wages are high enough, the monitor invests and the agent doesn't shirk. Okay, so that's a nice set of extensions to get off of a nice continuous time game. Where I would push a little bit is the applications. So applications of the model are somewhat hard because of the missing principle. So one, there's this question of who's paying the monitor, but you can imagine the reward structure that Martin posited. More to the point though, somebody has to be losing value from the agent shirking. And the model relies sort of critically or heavily on the critical difference between observable and verifiable information. That's what enables it to be a symmetric information game. I think the board of directors application is a bit of a tough fit because CEOs and top managers can be fired based on observation. You don't need proof to fire the CEO. You can do it on soft information rather than hard information. But at-will employment is not universal. So maybe this is setting specific. So one might look to settings where you really do need proof. To that end, the model is very well suited to arm's length transactions or arm's length relationships, where you are actually going to go to court. You have outside contracting, et cetera. One neat point here that the authors don't emphasize is the monitor has a strong incentive to fake evidence. So this is the reverse of the bribery extension. So there might be an application here to auditor compliance enforcement misconduct.
Mark, quickly, it's about 4 minutes and 20 seconds remaining.
4 minutes, all right. Well, okay, we're almost at the end. So I would give two main suggestions. One is to lean into the arm's length transaction settings. So when does one really require proof in order to act, okay? Or in the case of auditor misconduct, when might one want to create false proof? And here there's a neat feature of this model, which is it's really a model of investigation rather than prevention. Okay? So the monitor isn't really trying to stop the agent from shirking. They're trying to catch them shirking, which is a different job. And in fact, there is a distinction inside auditing firms between these two roles. The auditor that kind of checks financial statements to try to make sure that, okay, there's no fraud this time, versus the auditor who's doing, say, forensic accounting or investigative accounting, where they're actually going in because they think something is wrong and they're trying to figure out what it is. So there's actually a nice sort of application weighting here, which is investigations. You need to find proof because you intend to go to court, because you need hard information for some action rather than soft. Or my suggestion would be to go the other way, tie the monitor's wages to losses from the agent shirking. So someone inside the organization has to care about the shirking. My worry is maybe this results in full monitoring and no shirking, because there is a wage schedule that will do that. Or possibly endogenize the outside option to reflect some kind of labor market. So say, given maybe the monitor gets a reset when they go to a new employer, given that, what would their outside labor market look like if that outside labor market is the monitor's outside option? How does that change their incentive to investigate? In all, the authors have created a simple but deep model. It has some elegant solutions and useful extensions. The main contribution, I would say, is the role of experimentation and agent testing. This is the notion that the agent actively tries to sort of experiment and sabotage the monitor to reveal them to be the low type. Because of that, the monitor-agent relationship is always aggressive. Testing is followed by detection or monitor obsolescence. And this is a nice point in favor of the continuous time game setup rather than the principal agent format that one is more used to. I do think the model might be more suited to sort of the general problem of investigations across different corporate settings, rather than sort of a generic oversight application to boards of directors. So all in all, a very nice model that I appreciated reading. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Mark. Right on time, in fact, a bit early, so that's perfect. So the next paper is Contracting and Search with Heterogeneous Principles and Agents by Jan Starmans. As we transition, I want to remind the audience that you can ask your questions in the Q&A window, and the authors will do their best to address them during the session. And otherwise, I think we're all set with Jan. You've got 20 minutes to present. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for organizing this this session. So the starting point for this paper is a very simple observation, which is that moral hazard and search frictions affect many important markets, and they affect them jointly. So locating a trading partner takes time and other resources typically. But even once the trading partner is located, the exchange process itself is often subject to moral hazard. So as examples, you can think of a labor market for managers. You can think about the market for venture capital. Now, despite the fact that it is true that these two trading frictions jointly affect many important markets, the interaction between these two frictions remains an open question. So why is that an important part to understand? Of course, we understand that these two trading frictions, or search frictions and moral hazard, are going to lead to inefficiencies independent of each other. But in addition, it's important to understand whether the interaction between these frictions, whether there is any interaction between these frictions, how that looks like, and whether that has any additional welfare implications that we should be aware of. In particular, we want to understand whether any changes to the contractual environment, to the contracting environment, affect search behavior and vice versa in decentralized markets. So in this paper, I develop a theory of contracting and search to address these questions. And what I do is I incorporate a very standard risk-neutral principal-agent model with contractual constraints into a standard random search model. Here, contractual constraints are going to capture limited wealth or a minimum wage in labor markets, or statutory to limit liability in financial markets as examples. The key innovation in this paper is to introduce what I call heterogeneity in principles and agents production technologies in terms of the distribution of output across states of nature. So this is going to capture the very intuitive ideas that if we think about possible transactions in an economy, they not only differ in how much surplus they're able to generate, but also in terms of the contracting problem that's associated with the production of the surplus. And while most of the focus of this existing search literature is really on the heterogeneity in surplus, I focus on this idea of contractual heterogeneity. I find that the interaction of these two trading frictions, contracting and search frictions, lead to inefficiently lengthy search. And I show that this welfare loss critically really arises only due to the interaction of these frictions and not independently from these frictions. And it also crucially depends on the degree of heterogeneity of these production technologies in this economy. I show that in this environment, lower search costs and contractual innovations can actually reduce welfare by magnifying this effect. And more broadly, what this framework does, it implies a theory of what I call contractual specialization, in the sense that particular types of principles will specialize in contracting with particular types of agents using specific types of contracts. Now, this paper contributes to the growing literature on the topic of contracting and search under moral hazard or adverse selection. So here's some sort of hidden information. And most closely related is, of course, the subset of the literature that focuses on moral hazard. The contribution here is to introduce this notion of contractual heterogeneity by introducing heterogeneity in principles and agents production technologies in terms of the distribution of output across states of nature. And as such, this paper uncovers a novel source of inefficiency in decentralized markets. In the contracting literature, it's of course well known that the distribution of output matters in addition to average output. The key point here is to introduce that idea into a context with search, so introducing that idea into a decentralized market. And finally, the paper contributes to the literature on wage and contract dispersion by providing a novel theory of contract and rent, or contract and wage dispersion. I'll focus mostly on the partial equilibrium framework, which is in the paper, and then show you how it extends to the general equilibrium framework. So in the partial equilibrium framework, I consider an environment with risk neutrality. There's discrete infinite time horizon. There's a common time discount factor shared by everybody. Now there's a single principal, and that principal is going to generate an output in each period, and that's independent across time. And there's an output xi in some state I, and there's a finite number of states. And without an agent's effort, the probability distribution of this output, which is stochastic, is given by Q. So think of Q as the principal's baseline production technology. And I assume that each of these states has a positive probability under this baseline production technology. But the principal can contract with a single agent. So let me tell you about the agents. There is a finite set of different types of agents. And they are similar, so they're denoted by K, so that's the type of the agent. They're identical along some dimensions. So in each period, they are going to have a reservation utility, which is equal to U, and identical across agents. They're going to decide between exerting effort and shirking, which is non-contractable, and they have a disutility of effort, which is equal to C, and also identical across agents. Now, these agents differ in terms of their production technology, which here I denote by this delta K. What does this mean? It means that if the principal contracts with a type K agent, but this agent shirks, then the output distribution is simply given by Q, this principal's baseline production technology. But if the agent decides to exert effort, then it's given by Q plus this delta K. So here, this delta K really describes how the agent's effort shifts probability mass across states of nature. I assume that all these agents also generate the same expected value of effort, which means the effort increases the expected output in the same way. So in expectation, they are identical. And that simply means that they're going to generate the same expected surplus of effort, right? So it's this idea of surplus being identical. And the idea here is simply to shut down an obvious channel for search, which is increasing match surplus. And that allows me to isolate the novel contribution of my paper in a more transparent way. Now, contracting and search frictions. If unmatched, the principal can decide to search, and there's a search cost kappa potentially, and then draws a type K agent with probability mu K at the beginning of the next period. So here there are delay costs. That's why I don't need a positive search cost to begin with. The principal can then offer a series of one-period contracts. We can introduce a fixed cost of contracting to capture, for example, financing cost, if we think about a finance application, corporate finance application. And then a one-period contract is simply a fully state contingent contract for output in that period. And the crucial thing is to introduce contractual constraints. So the contractual payoff to the agent, which is this SI, has to exceed theta in each state. So set this to 0, and it's simply a standard limited liability constraint. Now, I have an extension in the appendix of the paper that discusses an extension to long-term contracts, to a specific set of long-term contracts. The key point here is to keep the contracting problem as simple as possible to highlight this interaction of contracting and search, but that extends also to environments with long-term contracts. Then the match breaks up with some exogenous probability delta at the end of each period. In terms of applications, we can think of the principal as a firm searching for a worker, or firm or shareholders searching for a CEO, where workers differ in their human capital, and the contractual constraints capture a wealth constraint or minimum wage. Or we can think of the principal as an investor that's searching for an investment opportunity, so searching for entrepreneurs, where entrepreneurs differ in terms of their assets. And here, contractual constraints would simply capture limited liability. Now, let me first show you a benchmark where I drop these contractual constraints. So there's no limited liability as an example. Equivalently, you can consider simply a benchmark with where effort is contractible, so without moral hazard. So here, the optimal one-period contract is going to maximize the principal's expected payoff in that period, subject to the incentive constraint and the participation constraint of the agent. Now, as is standard, as we know from contracting theory, in this type of contracting problem, the agent's participation constraint is going to bind. That implies that the principal is going to obtain the full expected surplus, and the equilibrium, therefore, is going to be very simple. The principal is going to search whenever it is efficient to do so, and then contracts with an agent independent of the agent's type. And that turns out to be first best efficient. So here I shut down differences in surplus. The principal obtains all surplus. There's simply no point in continuing to search once the principal has indeed met an agent. Now let's switch on these contractual constraints, or equivalently, let's switch on moral hazard. Now, again, as is well known, agents are going to earn rents potentially in this environment, agency rents. And this simple environment, we can write down these agency rents in closed form. And in particular, that depends. So this is the agency rent of an agent K meeting the principal. And crucially, it depends, as is well known, again, I'm not going to tell you anything new about the contracting, bilateral contracting here. It's going to depend on the maximum likelihood ratio. So an agent that has a higher maximum likelihood ratio is an agent that for which output is more informative about the agent's effort and therefore requires a lower agency rent under optimal contracts. Now, this is the reason, so we can basically summarize the whole contracting problem simply in terms of the agency rent. And that's the only thing that's going to be relevant for the principal and the agents to make decisions in this environment. And that's the reason that this problem becomes tractable. So taking just a one step back briefly, if you think about the contracting problem, the search and contracting problem here, the principal is searching in a multidimensional set of agents. So the types are multidimensional, the changes in probability distributions. Contracts are endogenous. So from the outset, it seems that this is really an intractable model. Because we can summarize everything into this agency rent, this one, think of it as like a sufficient statistic, that problem then actually becomes very tractable. Now it's a simple search problem in a threshold strategy in terms of the agency rent. So in the presence of these rents, if it's still profitable for the principal to search, which is when this inequality is satisfied, then the principal searches if unmatched and contracts with an agent only if the agency rent is below this endogenously determined threshold. And that is indeed constrained inefficient if there are agents that require agency rents that exceed this threshold. Let me come back to the main idea, which is very intuitive. The principal might meet an agent today that requires a high agency rent under optimal contracts. The principal realizes that if she continues to search, she's not going to meet more profitable agents in terms of surplus, because all agents have the same surplus in this economy by assumption. But of course, the principal, if there are agents in this economy that require sufficiently lower agency rent, has an incentive to search for these agents. So it's a pure, think of this like an option value of search that arises due to the interaction of contracting and search frictions. And because it's a pure rent reduction motive, it creates inefficiently lengthy search. So a social planner would simply offer a contract immediately and contract with that agent to avoid these delay costs. There can, of course, also be environments where it is not profitable for the principal to search. Here, the presence of agency rent simply can deter search by the principal, and that can be constrained inefficient. So what is nice about this framework is that contracts and search decisions are endogenous. So we can think about changes to the contracting and the search environment. So let me focus on two here. Let's think about the first one, a higher search cost. So a higher search cost is going to reduce this probability of continued search, so this lengthy search. And the welfare effect of that is then going to be ambiguous. So it's going to curb this bad incentive to kind of this rent reduction motive, which is good, but it makes each unit of search more costly, and that makes that overall effect on welfare ambiguous. But one can show that a higher search cost in this environment can actually increase welfare. Let me move to the third one in the interest of time. I study what I call contractual innovations, and that simply captures, think of this like an expansion of the state space. That means simply that the principal can suddenly write more complex contracts. That's good for contracting. But the effect on the probability of search, of this continued search, and the effect on welfare is going to be ambiguous. And the reason is that if this contractual innovations significantly reduces the agency rents of some agents in this economy that might have already had lower rents, this can actually intensify this rent reduction motive, because now the principal really wants to find these types of agents. There's some other experiments and comparative statics in the paper as well. Now, let me move on to the general equilibrium framework and just show you, tell you how it differs. So in the general equilibrium framework, I consider a continuum of principles and agents. There are two types of principles, each with a measure half, that differ in this underlying production technology, this baseline production technology, QJ. And there are two types of agents which differ, as I described before, in terms of how they change the probability distribution, how they shift across states of nature as they exert effort. So here, a principal contracting, a type J principal contracting with a type K agent, means that if the agent does not exert effort, the output distribution is given by QJ, which now critically depends on the principal's type. So principals differ here, as well as agents. But if the agent exerts effort, then the output distribution depends on both the principal and the agent's type, the sum of these two. Unmatched principals meet unmatched agents at random. Thank you, Simon. I got the message. Unmatched principals meet unmatched agents at random. Their contractual constraints here, I set the low bound simply to 0, so simple limited liability. And the agent's outside option is set to B. So that's when they're unmatched. Think of this as like unemployment insurance or generally the benefit of being unmatched. And I consider the economy in steady state equilibrium. Now, again, a benchmark, which is similar to the one I had before, no contractual constraints or no moral hazard. Again, the agent's participation constraint is going to bind under optimal contracts, and we again get a good type of equilibrium. Here, I call it a full matching equilibrium. So here, each type of principal offers a contract to each type of agent, so independent of who the principal meets. And the reason is that the principal obtains the full expected surplus. So there's no reason for continued search. And that's, again, first best efficient. Now, once we introduce contractual constraints, the expected contractual payoff of an agent, we can write as the sum of what I've referred to as the incentive payoff and the fixed payoff, where the fixed payoff is simply matching reservation utilities, so it's a non-negative payoff. And the incentive payoff depends on the maximum likelihood ratio again, right? And that again here, crucially, is a function of both the principals and the agent's type. And I consider symmetric equilibrium where type 1 principals meeting type 1 agents are going to require a low incentive payoff under optimal contracts. And that's the same for type 1, type 2 principal meeting a type 2 agent. But if they meet the opposite types, they require a high incentive payoff. And of course, these are endogenous objects, right? They're rents, or here incentive payoffs. But crucially, one can always construct technologies that are going to generate this type of structure, basically a particular type of maximum likelihood ratio. Now, the steady state equilibrium, they're going to be two symmetric equilibria. One is, again, a full matching equilibrium. So even though we might have these differences in these incentive payoffs, we might still get a full matching equilibrium where each principal type offers a contract to each agent type. And again, this is first best efficient. But what we can also get is this partial matching equilibrium, where type 1 principals offer contracts only to type 1 agents and type 2 principals only to type 2 agents. And crucially, that's going to generate a persistent measure of unmatched principals and agents in equilibrium, which is inefficient. Again, the reason is this rent reduction motive. So type 1 principals might meet type 2 agents. They can offer contracts. They might even make a profit under these optimal contracts, but they realize there are other agents in this economy that require potentially much lower compensation, and therefore there's an incentive to search. This can also generate multiple equilibria, so there's strategic complementarities in this framework. And here you can see what I mean by this contractual specialization. So type 1 principals sort of specialize in contracting with type 1 agents using specific type of contracts, and type 2 principals with type 2 agents. In conclusion, so I show you, and what I show in this paper is that the interaction of contracting search frictions can lead to inefficiently lengthy search. This welfare loss crucially only arises due to the interaction of these frictions, and also crucially depends on the degree of heterogeneity of technologies in this economy. Lower search costs and contractual innovations can reduce welfare in the setting. And more broadly, what this framework provides is a theory of what I call contractual specialization.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Jean. The discussant is Vincent Glode. And as before, given that many people came in and out, I want to remind the audience that you can ask your questions in the Q&A panel. And hopefully we'll have time, or the presenters will have time to answer them during the session. So Vincent, you have 15 minutes. You're muted, Vincent.
Thank you, Simon, for inviting me to discuss this paper. This was fun to read. Let me start with a brief summary of the paper. First, it's one of these papers where the title is very informative about what's going on in the paper. There's no like quote from like a book or from a movie. Contracting and search with heterogeneous principles and agents. So there's a contracting problem, optimal contracting with search frictions, and we'll have heterogeneity among principles and agent, right? So the paper will allow us to ask questions such as, how is contracting behavior impacted by search frictions? How is search behavior impacted by contracting friction? So we'll mix the first two elements in the title. And the third element is just there to make things more interesting, right? To have like a reason to search so that you might meet somebody who's a little bit different than the person who's in front of you. Another good way to summarize the paper is through equation 3, which Jan already went over, but I think it's important to stop there, take our time to understand how the one period contracting problem is characterized. So we have a principal meeting an agent, and the principal will choose a contract so that it maximizes some surplus subject to a few constraints. So let's go over the constraints. First, you need the expected payment to the agent under PK, which is the distribution of outcome after effort has been exerted, the distribution of the payments to the agent minus the cost of exerting effort to be greater than the expected payment to the agent without effort. Now, the principal must first incentivize the agent to exert costly effort. One thing we'll notice is that because the distribution of outcomes after effort has been exerted is different among agents, we'll have heterogeneous agency rents. Now, the principal also faces an homogeneous contracting friction. Think of a minimum wage where the payment to the agent in a given state needs to satisfy some constraint. Right? So that will allow us to do some comparative statics on theta. Now, the principal must also satisfy an agent's homogeneous participation constraints. So the agent must get at least U in utility. Now, there's not much going on with U in the sense that, you know, for the most interesting cases, it's going to be replaced by the contracting friction. So it's going to be what binds for the principal is to make sure that the principal offers at least theta in most states. And then given all these constraints, the principal will try to maximize his share of the surplus when evaluating a match. The principal won't look at the full surplus, but instead it will look at the full the social surplus minus the agency rents. So that will lead to potentially socially inefficient search behavior by principal because of the rents that need to be shared with the agent. Right? So warning, paper is R&R at the Journal of Economic Theory. Congrats, it's well-deserved. It's a very nice paper, but I didn't want to add to lists, I'm sure, of robustness checks and extensions. So what I did is I tried to focus my comments on the interpretation, the contribution, and the motivation rather than the analysis, because I know that these things should be pretty stable going forward. So the principle, the optimal contract, S star K, gives each agent K a bonus in the state I that is the most informative about this agent's effort, right? So SI of K is equal to first, kind of the contracting friction, the minimum wage that we talked about, plus a bonus in state I. What is state I? Sorry, in this case, in state J. What is state J? is the state where effort is most likely to have contributed to reaching that state, right? So how do we define this? This, what Jan talked about as like the maximum likelihood. It's delta IK, which is the increase in the probability that this outcome happens relative to the baseline probability that this outcome would have happened without effort. When you maximize this, this is the state of the world where effort is most likely to have happened, right? Now, this will yield an agency rent that depends on K, right? So it's denoted A of K, but you could see that it depends on this maximum likelihood quantity that we talked about. So what that means is that agents production technologies, delta K, are heterogeneous, which implies that the most informative states about agents' effort could be heterogeneous, depending on whether effort translates more into, the I outcome, the medium outcome, and so on. It will tell us something about when we'll end up paying that bonus, and that will lead to heterogeneous agency rents. And it's this heterogeneity in how much surplus the principal must share with each agent that causes the principal to search too much in equilibrium. Perhaps one agent is more expensive to incentivize than another one, so we'll search. Even though the surplus of matching with any agent, the social surplus of matching with each agent is the same, since some agents might be more expensive to incentivize because of the kind of this shape, this production function, then we might end up having inefficient search. Okay. Now, the paper, and the paper, not only the paper, but also Jan's presentation, they emphasize the importance of the heterogeneity in principles and agents production technologies for the result, right? I pick one quote from the literature review. The existing literature either considers homogeneous agents or heterogeneity in agents' expected surplus. The contribution of this paper is to introduce heterogeneity in principles and agents' production technologies in terms of the distribution of output across states of nature. But any heterogeneity in how much surplus the principal gets under the optimal contract with a specific agent could lead to the same outcomes, right? So, for example, right, we could have heterogeneity in expected surplus like in the other papers, right? Although, if that was the case, search might not be inefficient. Heterogeneity in cost of effort for the agent, right? So, if we had heterogeneity in cost of effort, perhaps some agents will require to be paid more, and that will lead to inefficient search. Heterogeneity in reservation utility, heterogeneity in contracting friction, heterogeneity in the ability to observe an agent's effort, or many other friction not currently modeled in the paper, right? All these things could lead to differential agency rents, and therefore, it will affect search. Clearly, the fact that the model's main insights are general is a good thing. I want to keep that. But my recommendation is to be a little bit more careful when interpreting the results, and tying our hands with the interpretation that this heterogeneity must come from the production side. Right? I will also rethink about how to describe the contribution to the literature in light of the actual importance of the heterogeneity in production technologies. There's a lot of other ways to create a similar behavior by creating heterogeneity in agency rents. So I'm not sure you want to go all in on this as being your main contribution. In that spirit, I think you could clarify how the role played by the contracting friction theta generalizes to anything that generates agency rents. Right now, think of it as limited liability or minimal wage, so that the principal cannot extract in some states of the world all the surplus that is given as a bonus in other states of the world, so that the agent does not end up with zero surplus, right? There's a lot of other ways to get this. It's not clear that the only way to do it is through a constant theta. I think a discussion of kind of the type of contracting frictions that will work will be a good idea. Right? Now, speaking of the channel, right, and this goes a little, this resembles a little bit what Mark did in his discussion. I'm trying to fit what we're seeing in the model to what we're seeing in reality, right? So let's think about what the channel is here, right? A principal might inefficiently search too much for agents in a contractual environment with minimum wage or limited liability because some agents' production technologies lead to too large agency rents under the optimal contract. That's kind of the channel. Now, the paper and Jan's presentation mentioned labor economics and financial economics as two applications for the model, right? But even in the paper, we're talking about the principal being a firm, the agent being an employee, and the contracting friction being a minimal wage, right? But it lacks details in the sense that what I'd like to see is, are there situations, right? Concrete, puzzling situations, perhaps just anecdotes, where the specific channel in the model teaches us something, right? So are there cases where we observe firms waiting too long before they hire an agent because they're worried about the production technology of that agent, right? I'd like you to tie the model and the actual kind of channel that is featured in the paper to kind of actual situations, right?
And here, about 4 minutes left.
Perfect.
Sorry.
And here, empirical facts will be nice, but otherwise just anecdotes to at least, use the specific channel that is highlighted in the paper in a stronger way, right? So we need heterogeneous production technologies, or at least in agency rents, as I pointed out in the first, in my first half of the discussion. Heterogeneous agency rents, we need some contractual frictions, and we need to observe something that suggests that there's too much search by principals. And your model could speak to that to those situations, and it could shed light on why they happen. Okay, just to summarize, it's a very interesting model that studies the interactions between contracting and search friction. So I'm not surprised that it's R&R at JET. My recommendations, I will clarify the importance of the specific type of heterogeneity and the specific type of contracting friction. I will also try to identify concrete situations that this specific channel speaks to. I have another kind of more minor recommendation, and it's more on the editing side. When reading the paper and even in the presentation, there's a lot of repetition when you reach section 3, the general equilibrium part. And it will be nice if you could better nest the partial equilibrium analysis into the general equilibrium analysis in your paper so that it's more efficient of a paper and we don't have to go through 2 separate sets of assumptions that are almost identical, right? So good luck with the paper. I had fun reading it and discussing it.
Thank you very much, Vincent. It seems like people are being very disciplined with their time, and as such, my risk aversion is starting to lower a little bit. So, Jan, if you want to take a minute or two to comment on this, that would be fine. I apologize to Martin. I didn't give you the opportunity earlier, but I was too risk averse at that point. So we'll circle back. Jan?
Yes, great. Thank you. So, Vincent, thank you very much for this in-depth discussion, even going down to the formulas and the contracting problem. So in the interest of time, let me make some sort of two broad responses. So I like the idea of exploring other potential sources of heterogeneity in agency rents. I explored this idea of production technologies, but I think there's sort of a broader insight here, right? So I think there's a point about we have kind of, if we think about, let's take the example of a venture capitalist, right? A venture capitalist sort of going on about searching for investment opportunities. And the typical way to think about this always is, who's the more valuable entrepreneur, right? Who generates more value in the future? What this points out is, there there's sort of a contractual side. There's sort of contractual complementarities potentially in this world, and that's really kind of what this paper is about. But I agree with you that that's not it's not sort of strictly the only source is not only the production technology side. Now, in terms of heterogeneity, of course, some sources of heterogeneity that you mentioned, so think about expected surplus or the cost of effort. Some of it can, of course, also lead to search behavior, right? But of course, here, as you already mentioned also in your discussion, the crucial thing is that the inefficiency applications are very different, right? So if there is heterogeneity in expected surplus, there's of course reason to search. So even a social planner would want kind of a venture capitalist to kind of keep on searching to find the best entrepreneurs in this economy. So once you have heterogeneity in production technologies in the way I define it, you get this purely inefficient search behavior. And what I mean is that by the degree of heterogeneity being crucial is that in this model, if you let everybody have the same production technology, nothing is going to happen, right? There's again immediate contracting still under some rent sharing. In terms of the application, so I guess the issue is empirically to identify, sort of think about what's the difference between inefficient and efficient search. So if we think about a venture capitalist sort of going through different investment proposals, are they taking too long to kind of say, no, this is it, here we want to kind of invest, right? And I guess the only thing I can say is that my model offers sort of a different interpretation, right? Rather than, oh, they're taking so much time because they're really going for the best opportunities, versus they're just finding, they're also thinking about the contracting side being efficient. And I think, just broadly speaking, I think there is this idea that in this type of world, there's really a lot of tailoring of contracts. Right? So at least that's where the model fits very well, where really there's a tailoring of VC contracts to the specific investment opportunities. But thank you again very much for this insightful discussion.
Very good. Thank you very much. Again, because people are trickling in and out, a reminder that Q&A window is open for questions if you have them. And our next presenter is Boris Nikolov, who's going to talk about managerial beliefs and the cross-section of incentives and compensation. So Boris, if you could share. We can see it. Let's see if we can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the conference organizers for having the paper on the program. It's a pleasure to be here. This is joint work with Lukas, Schmid and Roberto, Steri. So in this paper, we ask two fundamental questions. The first one being, how do managerial beliefs affect incentives and corporate policies? In a standard separation of ownership and control framework, what is the effect of differences of opinion between managers and shareholders, and how do those differences affect the decision-making process? The subsequent question we're going to raise is, how are we going to set up a managerial optimal compensation contract that is going to take into account those managerial beliefs? So those are the two questions we are going to go after in this paper. So what is going to be our novel approach to tackle those questions? So first of all, we are going to rely on novel managerial level survey data on beliefs. So we have very rich, detailed, very granular data on that gives us the ability to measure managerial beliefs in a very refined way. So the first point. And the second point is that we're going to build an estimate dynamic contracting model that we're going to augment with managerial beliefs to make inference. So I believe, and we do believe, that this is going to be the very first paper that tackles this question quantitatively. So we examine in a quantitative fashion what's the effect of beliefs on the optimal contract. So to give you a flavor of what we do in this paper, I have some sort of preview of paper ingredients of the results. So we're going to focus on beliefs that take the form of optimism or pessimism, of overconfidence or underconfidence, or over extrapolation. And we're going to show that in our data set, those are prevalent, and also they exhibit quite interesting cross-sectional variation. And then we're going to look at what the effects of those beliefs are quantitatively, and they end up to be very important on both the level and the composition of the optimal contract. So on the menu, I'm going to walk you through the model, this dynamic contracting model that we augment with beliefs. I'm going to show you what our, I believe, very novel and exciting data is, and show you our early on results. So the model basics, we have an infinite horizon, discrete time stochastic environment. We work in partial equilibrium. Everyone is going to be so far risk neutral. And this is a corporate finance paper, so the stochastic discount factor is R, and R is going to be constant. And we have taxes and limited liability. So here you have the technology setup. We have a production function that is composed of Z plus eta, 2 technology shocks that multiply K to the alpha minus F. So we have a pretty standard, up to a few exceptions, production function. So the company uses capital to produce output. We have decreasing returns to scale, alpha is lower than 1. And we have a fixed cost so that we can generate negative profits that we observe in the data. So what is not standard is to have not 1, but rather 2 shocks here. So the first shock is going to be Z. Z follows an AR1 in logs, that's pretty standard. And we are going to introduce at this level the managerial beliefs. So shareholders observe the process as is, AR1 in logs, that is characterized by 3 parameters, the mean mu, autocorrelation rho, and the volatility sigma. Now managers' view will be different. We allow in the model managers to exhibit a bias in those 3 parameters that are going to govern the dynamics of the Z shock. In particular, we are going to allow the bias to be either negative or positive. And here we are not going to impose any restriction. We're going to basically let the data speak. Let's see what we observe in the real data, and then we calibrate or estimate the parameter as is on the main sample and subsamples. Importantly, if mu tilde is greater than 0, this means that managers' subjective belief is that the average profit is going to be higher. When we talk about optimism, the manager is optimistic. If mu tilde is negative, then there is pessimism, okay? And then rho tilde greater than 0 means that managers are going to put more weight when they do inference on the recent observations of the shock. So there is going to be over extrapolation, and you have under extrapolation if this rho tilde is negative. And finally, we have the sigma delta, that is going to be the bias that affects volatility. If sigma delta is lower than 0, this means that the manager is overconfident. Overconfident means that the manager expects the volatility to be actually effectively lower. And if the bias is positive, we have underconfidence. So this is we believe, a very simple but yet powerful way to introduce managerial beliefs in how the manager sees differently from the shareholder the prospects of the firm. In addition to that, we consider a second shock, that's the eta shock. This is simply going to take a form of an IID shock that takes the level of eta, the value of eta with probability kappa, and the value of minus eta with probability 1 minus kappa. So I'm going to rationalize why we need this modeling ingredient in a couple of minutes. So bear with me on that front. There is a specific reason. This is to introduce the moral hazard aspect of the model. So this is upcoming. So in addition of the technology side, we have investment. Investment is going to simply be capital tomorrow minus depreciated capital today, and investment is associated with capital adjustment costs. So all this is very standard in terms of investment technology, but now the investment level and dynamics will be affected by the specific managerial beliefs. Then we introduce basically the second eta shock in the production function, okay? We are going to assume that there is asymmetric information between insiders and outsiders. So only the insider, the manager, observes the second shock, the eta. Outsiders don't observe this shock. So because of this asymmetric information, there is going to be scope for moral hazard. We are going to also allow the manager to have a biased perception of the shock itself. So there is a difference in how the manager and the shareholder do view the evolution of the shock eta. I'm not going to go into those details here. So if there is asymmetric information, eta is only observable by the manager, then managers now have an incentive to do what? Well, to underreport and capture a larger part of profit. So here we talk about simply private benefits, extraction of resources of the manager at the expense of shareholders, given a standard technology. And the standard technology is simply a fraction lambda that the manager can extract of the profit at the expense of shareholders. So now this is the moral hazard framework. So now in this setup, what can we do? Well, from the perspective of the shareholder, what we're going to do is simply devise an optimal contract to induce the right incentives. So the optimal contract in this framework will take two forms. We'll have two ingredients. First, we're going to pay the manager current compensation each period that we label tau. And then we're going to award the manager deferred compensation, or the present value of all deferred compensation in the future that we label V. So the managerial compensation contract takes the form of current and deferred compensation, and importantly, both ingredients are going to be state contingent. So we really have a performance-based state contingent flavor of the contract. And now what's going to be the shareholders' problem to be solved? Well, shareholders want to maximize shareholder value by doing what? By structuring the incentive compatible contracts such that the manager is induced to reveal the truth in the presence of moral hazard. So we're going to solve the problem such that we shape the contract that induces the manager to always systematically reveal the truth and never divert and expropriate resources. So this is the focus we have here. Importantly, now we take into account managerial beliefs. Shareholders are going to take into account managerial beliefs when structuring the current and the deferred compensation by simply taking expectations under the possibly biased, distorted managerial beliefs. So this is how we solve the problem. So it turns out that the model, unfortunately, has no closed form solution, unlike some of the evidence we have seen prior to this paper. So what we do is to resort to solve numerically the problem. So the models at heart, our model is very difficult to tackle with conventional value function or alike type of iterative methods because everything is state contingent and it's simply too slow. Okay, so this is a hard problem to solve. So what do? Typically, when you're facing a hard problem, there are two alternatives. Alternative number one is you brute force your solution. So here you got a brute force, you get access to a supercomputer. Well, unfortunately, we don't have access to a supercomputer. We can't go with the brute force alternative. So I like to believe what we do is we go ahead with the smart alternative. And the smart alternative is basically you solve the same, but you use a different, more efficient method. And it's exactly what we do. So here what we're going to do is to rely on a linear programming representation of the LP representation of the dynamic programming problem, of the DP problem. And I believe this has been pioneered in our finance field by Ross Trickensin in a series of papers. And in addition to this LP technology, we have to resort to what is called constraint generation, separation oracle techniques. So given the short nature of the presentation, I don't have time to walk you through this, but I believe those are very exciting tools that allows us to basically write down more complex, more involved models. That's very useful for future research. So to give you a flavor of the model predictions, I give you the intuition, and then we can discuss further on when looking at the results. So the three biases, beliefs, optimism, overconfidence, and over-extrapolation are going to lead to overinvestment, and this overinvestment is going to be inefficient, value destroying. Managerial beliefs are going to also lead to higher both level and composition of the compensation contract, so higher level and higher deferred compensation. And we're going to observe that shareholders exploit the distorted beliefs to try to minimize the cost of compensation. And importantly, what I'm going to show you through our calibration results is that those effects, the effects of those beliefs are quantitatively material. So let me give you a sense of what our data consists of. So we're going to use the Survey of Business Uncertainty, SBU data, that has been collected by the Atlanta Fed along with Chicago and Stanford. This is a survey-based data. It is a survey that is run every month, starting from end of 2014. And in our sample, we have about 550 firms for about 3,600 observations. So the survey has been built by Altic with co-authors. So their paper is going to be documenting the construction of the survey and the specificities of the data. And I believe for the first time used by a recent paper by Barrero in a macrofinance framework. And we're going to complement this data with standard executive comp information. So the SBU data gives you a subjective probability distribution for firms' future sales. And we are going to extract information of that subjective distribution to build the expected biases for the manager. Importantly, the sample is broadly representative of the US economy. It has been shown that it oversamples larger firms. And typically the respondents of that survey are the top executives, in most of the cases, CEOs and CFOs of those firms that we have surveyed. So let me show you two pictures that summarize, give you in a nutshell the idea of this data. Basically, you're going to ask the CEO to characterize the distribution, his own subjective view of the distribution of growth of sales tomorrow, by basically simplifying the distribution and characterizing it as having 5 bins. And they're going to answer the first question: what is the level of the 5 bins? What are the 5 most likely outcomes for that growth rate of sales tomorrow? And in the second question, they're going to allocate associated probabilities for each one of the 5 bins. So think about, they build the histogram of the distribution where you have 5 bins. So they pin down through the survey the level and the associated probability of each bin. So what we get out of that distribution for our purposes is those 3 types of beliefs. So the first one is optimism. So optimism is measured as the difference between the forecast and the realized sales growth, an object we call the forecast error. The forecast sales growth is the subjective distribution mean at time t, and the realized growth is measured the subsequent period. So in our sample, what we have is that the forecast sales growth is about 4%, while the realized sales growth is about 4.2%. Okay, so the forecast error is negative. It's economically small, but it is going to generate some action, as you will see. So managers, on average, in our sample are neither optimistic or pessimistic. They're actually marginally pessimistic. So this mu tilde bias is slightly negative, converging to 0. So this is the first takeaway from the data. So now the second belief is confidence. So confidence is measured as the difference between the volatility under the realized and the subjective distribution of sales growth, something we refer to as excess absolute forecast error. And here volatility is simply measured as the mean absolute deviation under respectively the 2 distributions. So what we observe very interestingly here is that under the realized distribution, volatility is about 18.8%, while the subjective distribution only exhibits 3.6%. So we take away out of that managers are strongly overconfident. They severely underestimate volatility of outcomes tomorrow. So the bias that we have in this sigma parameter, sigma delta, is negative, and it's strongly negative. This is the second takeaway. Then the third one is extrapolation. It is measured as the correlation between the realized forecast error and the sales growth. So basically, you're going to regress the forecast error, the difference between the forecast and the realized sales growth, to the sales growth itself. So what we observe is that the regression coefficient is positive, 0.13 roughly. So we conclude that managers over extrapolate. So larger realized sales growth leads to a larger forecast mistakes. This means that if growth today is larger, observed today larger, this means that the mistake in terms of forecast I'm going to make tomorrow is larger. So I over extrapolate. So rho tilde, this bias in the autocorrelation, is going to be positive. So now that we have used this SBU data, what we can do is to calibrate our model. We plan on running a full-fledged estimation in the next version of the paper. So the technology parameters are standard. I have here highlighted in blue the beliefs parameters that we have gone through the definitions and constructions of. So managers are marginally pessimist, they are overconfident, and they over extrapolate. And on top of that, we have an agency, this divergent parameter that is set to 1%, and this is consistent with prior literature. So let me show you the first set of results. Here you have a number of moments generated by the model, as well as based on the real data. I have split the moments into the real moments and the beliefs and compensation moments. So the first takeaway from that table is that we do a reasonably good job at matching the real data with our augmented dynamic model. The first takeaway. The second takeaway is reported in the last column, where we are basically running a counterfactual. The counterfactual is what happens if we take the baseline model and we switch off all of the beliefs. We set the biases to 0. What happens? Well, what you observe first is that average profits increase because you eliminate all of the inefficiencies. And you also see that average investment marginally increases. It ballpark stays the same, but marginally increases. So here, basically, the three beliefs generate higher investment, but one of the beliefs is marginally negative, so they counteract each other to some degree. And interestingly, on the last line of that table, what you observe is that if you switch off the beliefs, the level of compensation as measured by total compensation scaled by assets in basis points drops by half. So this means that you have a preview here of the following tables. If you include those beliefs, you're going to have to compensate the manager more so that to elicit efficient decisions to avoid diversion. So now I would like to show you in the remaining 1 or 2 minutes that I have 3 counterfactuals. So what we do is to simply take the baseline model moments and compare those to an alternative where we switch off one by one the 3 beliefs. So first we look at the baseline versus the no optimism, no pessimism. So what do you observe? Well, you observe that investment is going to increase because now you're more optimist. Remember, the baseline is that you're marginally pessimist. So if you're more optimist, you invest more. And you see that the more optimist framework generates higher total compensation, going from 0.23 to 0.29. And you also see that not only the level, but the composition of compensation changes. You observe that the deferred compensation fraction over total compensation goes from 0.83 to 0.89. So not only the level, the composition changes as well. So we run a similar experiment with overconfidence. So here you see that if you go from no overconfidence to overconfidence, investment increases, total compensation increases, and yet again, deferred compensation as a fraction of total compensation increases. Interestingly enough, what you see here, we do more refined tests. We include 2 incremental moments. We look at what is total compensation over assets contingent on the profit being higher than median profit. And you observe that you have a wedge between the total compensation over assets on average in low profitability states that is lower than the one of high profitability states. This is quite intuitive. You want to reward the manager more in high profitability states because those are the states when he wants to divert resources. So you have to give him more to keep him incentive compatible. And you see that the dispersion between the low versus the high average compensation in the 2 average type of states basically widens. And finally, here you have the same evidence for extrapolation. When you
Boris, if you could take just 1 more minute, is that okay?
That's perfect. Yes. Okay. And then you see a similar evidence here, switch of extrapolation. Basically, you decrease investment, you decrease compensation, and fraction of deferred compensation to total one. Okay, so it goes into the same direction in a sense. So 2 last comments before I run out of time. We have, I believe, very exciting work in progress that exploits the cross-sectional heterogeneity in managerial beliefs. And what we ultimately want to do is to link the payments, as we solve the model for the payments to the manager, to actual contracts that we can identify through executive comp data. So we want to basically explicit the contract to the manager. So to conclude, I believe we have this dynamic contracting framework augmented with managerial beliefs, and we quantitatively show that effect of beliefs is important both on incentives and on the optimal contract. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Boris. The discussant is NGI. So Boris, if you could.
Yeah.
Yep, very good. So NG, you're on.
Okay, thank you, Simone, for
Perfect. All right, you got 15.
Inviting me to discuss the paper. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. I have another session to chair right after this. I guess we have 5 minutes. I wouldn't be able to hear for the, I leave 5 minutes, wouldn't be able to participate in the 5 minutes discussion after this, but Boris, we can talk afterwards. I'll be happy to. So very exciting, very, very interesting paper to read. Let me just start by summarizing the paper. It's a structural model, structural estimation of a model with dynamic moral hazard, capital accumulation, neoclassical kind of production function. So it's a kind of a standard model where people were used to study investment and CEO compensation in a corporate finance context. This paper brings that that model to think about, incentives and belief heterogeneity between shareholders and managers. The model has both observable and unobservable shocks in productivity, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. The model, the main purpose of the paper is to quantify the impact of the difference in beliefs. As Boris explained very clearly, that the model study, the quantitative study, focus on 3 types of heterogeneity in beliefs, which is over optimism, overconfidence, and over extrapolation. Let me just start by just kind of explain the main contracting frictions in the model, and I'll have my comments is going to focus mostly on the qualitative implications of the model. So let me just introduce the basic contracting problem. So I guess the other two papers in this session are more kind of like theoretical models that talk about qualitative implications of the contracting problem. This paper really differs in that aspect because the paper takes a neoclassical model, adding contracting frictions, and take the quantitative implication of the model seriously. So here's a basic contracting problem. So W is the value of the franchise to the principal, to the shareholders. K is the capital stock. Z is the observable productivity shock, and that's going to be a persistent process. V is the continuation utility of the manager. And this is a value function before the idiosyncratic shock realizes. So when I compute the value function, I'm going to aggregate, I'm going to take expectation over the realization of idiosyncratic and unobservable shock. So what's going to happen once the unobservable shock is realized? Well, the total output is going to be realized, and the total output depends on the unobservable shock. So it's not observable to the principal. The principal pays the agent tau as a function of the realization of idiosyncratic shock. And by the way, I wouldn't use tau, Boris. I would use consumption or some compensation or C or something for payment to the manager. And so this is a dynamic I formulated this slightly differently from the way that Boris did in the paper. I think the paper does not allow investment to depend on idiosyncratic shock, and I don't feel like that's really make a big difference, but I'm allowing investment to depend on idiosyncratic shock as well. This is the next period value function. So what are you choosing? The principal, the optimal contract basically choosing investment as a function of idiosyncratic shock, compensation to CEO as a function of idiosyncratic shock, unobservable shock, and the next period promise utility as a function of realization of idiosyncratic shock, as well as the next period utility. This is the key agency friction in the model, which is the idiosyncratic shock is not observable. Therefore, the investor would always, the incentive compatibility constraint requires the manager to always tell the truth, meaning that, truthfully reporting would always give him a higher utility than reporting some other realization of the idiosyncratic shock. And if you report otherwise, you're gonna get the consumption and promise utility associated with the a different shock. But you can also, the benefit of that is there's a stealing, right? Suppose you get a high productivity, you report low productivity, you're gonna get a difference between the realized productivity and the one that you actually report. I think there should be a minus sign before this. So if you report eta tilde and you actually produced pi eta, and you're gonna get difference between the two. And both agents are risk neutral. So that's an important part of this. And I think that's gonna affect the optimal contracting quite a bit. My main comments, it's an extremely interesting model. I'll talk a little bit about implications of the model, and very interesting data set that Boris had. Boris did a very good job in describing the data set and how to link the data set into the model. So I would not talk a lot about data set. I'll talk a little bit about computation method, which is really cool. The paper, as Boris said, is still preliminary, but I think there's a lot of interesting aspect of the paper. I felt like it can really be developed into a series of, potentially multiple papers, just expanding on different aspect of the model and its connection to the data. So let me first talk a little bit about, what does difference in belief do in this model? I want to start by a very simple trade-off, which is, suppose we start with a world where, both Boris and I just have $0 in our pocket. We have the same belief, and we each think we flip a coin. Simon's gonna flip a coin. We each think it's a probability of 1/2. So our utility is just gonna be 0, right? Suppose now Boris and I are both risk neutral, and I think the probability of has is 0.2, but Boris thinks it's 0.8, and he thinks the probability of tails is 0.2, and I think that's 0.8. So now, before Simon flips the coin, me and Boris is gonna agree that he's gonna give me $10 when it come up heads, and I'm gonna give him $10 when it's heads because I think it's probability that's really low, right? He's gonna give me back $10 when it's come up tail. So in this case, the net transfer is 0, but both of us get 6 units of expected utility. Why? Just because we have difference in belief. I think I'm paying him nothing. He think he's paying me nothing, right? But just because difference in belief, there's a utility gain. And we can double this. We can agree to pay each other $100. So all of a sudden, just because difference in belief, we would all have, just flipping a coin just give us, both of us, higher utility, right? What I mean is that, if both agents are risk neutral, difference in belief itself just can create a lot of utility gains. That's gonna be part of the force that's gonna drive the optimal contract in this model. So I think the model probably needs some conditions like this to make the solution non-trivial. My understanding, I think probably in the numerical computations, you guys are already implicitly assuming that imposing this. But I felt like some conditions like this, I like to see that I think some of conditions like this would probably have to hold. And if that is true, you probably want to put it in the paper. So what does this condition mean? In Demarzo-Sannikov, the model is quite similar to Demarzo-Sannikov. In Demarzo-Sannikov, what has to happen is that the principal would have to be more patient than the agent. So there's two forces in those models, right? First of all, you want to pay the agent as soon as possible because the agent is less patient. Second, incentive provision says that you want to postpone the payment into the future because that's what you need. In a long-term contract, you want to pay the carrots far into the future. That's what you can use to induce incentives. In this model, there's a little bit more than that because both agent and principal differ in their belief of the state. So assume Z is IID. I think you would need some conditions like this. Basically, the left-hand side equation says the arrow de Broglie price of a payment happened in a particular observable state Z prime for the principal would have to be higher than the arrow de Broglie price for 1 unit commodity paid in the same state. Why is that? Because if that is not true, it would always be better for the principal to pay the agent in the state where the agent thinks is more likely to happen. So if Boris hires me, he can always tell me, suppose I'm just more optimistic toward S&P 500, then Boris can always tell me, he said, Hengji, I'm gonna pay you $1 million if S&P is above 4,000 by the end of the year. I think there's a lot of probability that's gonna happen. He thinks it's 0 probability. And better yet, he could tell me that, hey, Hengji, I'm gonna pay you in 2 years. If S&P is about 5,000, $10 million. 3 years, if S&P is, because by postponing that payment, he can use that as an incentive. He can do two things by postponing that payment. One, he can use as an incentive provision device. Two, are the likelihood as we go into the future, if this condition doesn't hold, as we go into the future, the ratio, the likelihood ratio of that particular event happening is widening over time. So I'm gonna think compared to his belief, I think it's very likely to happen that S&P is going to be up above 6,000 in 3 years. He thinks that's probability 0. So I think I'm going to be a billionaire under the contract. And Boris thinks he's paying me nothing, right? Wouldn't that be a good incentive provision device?
But just
yeah.
quickly, about 4 minutes.
Okay. So in general, I think it would be, I would benefit from the paper discussing more qualitatively, when does cash payment happen and how does this happen? And of course, with risk aversion, Mark has a really nice paper at RFS paper that talk about, disagreement itself can become a source of risk. The second aspect that I want to talk a little bit about is the model has really interesting implications on investment, because one thing I think in the model is true is that there's going to be I think with same belief, there's going to be underinvestment. Why? Because the benefit of stealing is going to be increasing in the size of the firm. So what happens is that when the principal think about investment decision, I think I'm not going to invest a lot, because the larger the firm is, the more benefit of stealing. So there's going to be, in general, the model is going to produce a, just relative to standard Q theory in corporate finance, there's going to be also a marginal agency cost of investment. That's going to give you some underinvestment. However, with difference in belief, there may be also a force for overinvestment, because if the agent think high productivity is more, states is going to be more likely, you want to generate a higher cash flow in a high productivity state, right? So it's not clear which force dominate, but I think the model could potentially have really interesting implications on, failures of Q theory, because there's going to be other factors that come into this Q theory. There's going to be a marginal cost of investment. There's also going to be, difference in belief that come into standard investment decisions. And I think that's going to be summarized, of course, by, promise utility in a dynamic contracting framework. There's a Minnesota, last year we have grad students in Minnesota who has a nice paper on, difference in belief in investment. I think is very complementary. He doesn't have any, agency frictions, but he has some interesting implications on how difference in belief affects investment as well. I don't know whether I have time or not, but if I have 2 minutes, I'll explain a little bit about this really cool computation method.
Exactly 2 minutes, Hengji.
Okay, all right. So the paper used linear programming to solve incentive problems, and it's not very commonly used method, but I think it's really nice and a very good way of solving this type of problems. A very simple example how you do these things. This is a simple example where standard portfolio choice problem, you maximize the expected utility subject to, you're going to have initial wells, you have a risk-free asset, you have a risky asset, right? And this is a nonlinear problem because utility has a risk curvature in it. How do I do this with linear programming? So I think of C as taking a finite number of values. Instead of choosing C, I want to think of choosing a probability distribution on the grid of C points, right? So I'm a probability distribution of n elements, and these are, restrictions that you would put in a linear programming code. And corresponding to each realizations of C, there's going to be a realization, a vector of U. So when I compute my objective function, I'm just going to compute the expectation of mu. Now I'm choosing a probability vector. I'm not choosing a single consumption, right? So my constraint becomes the expected consumption is going to be equal to my, the total investment. These are constraints on, X vector being a utility. Now the solution could potentially give you a distribution on a grid points of consumption, but of course we know that consumption has to be, happen with certainty. However, a non-trivial distribution will never be optimal here just because U is concave, right? So the optimal solution is only gonna pick that one consumption point. So just because a lot of economic problems has concavity in it, and we don't need to worry about this. So I can formulate this into a nice, simple linear programming problem. In this problem, we don't all, it's kind of an overkill, but the nice thing about linear programming problems is adding constraint doesn't really add to the complication of the computation, right? So in contract design problems, incentive compatibility constraints, there's a lot of inequality constraint that would be nightmare for nonlinear programming problems to solve, but the cost is very, very small when you solve it using linear programming problem. That's kind of the efficiency gain with the linear programming problem that Boris was doing. That's really, really cool, I think. So let me just summarize. There's a lot of cool things can be done in the model, and I think bringing the belief data to CEO paid investment is a really, really important and interesting direction for future research. I think this computational method is really cool. I think being, as someone who also worked on kind of bringing contracting problems into their quantitative implications, I think this method should find more applicability in those area. And I really look forward to next version or next versions. I really think there can be multiple papers that grow out of this. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Hengji. Boris, if you want to take a couple minutes to say a few things about the discussion.
So thank you, Hengji, for the very thoughtful and I believe very useful discussion. As you have seen, the paper is still in a fairly rough format. I've shown you what we have built and what we can do with it. I think there is much more care to be done, and we have to make progress on showing explicitly the properties of the optimal contract. And we certainly will do that in the next version, and certainly with the feature on impatience or non-impatience and how this affects the results. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Overall, I'll be happy to discuss afterwards. Yes.
Okay, thank you guys. I just want to check out. I'm chairing another session, Simon. Sorry that.
Thank you, Hengji.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But let's talk later, Boris. I'll be happy to.
Sure.
It's really cool paper.
Are there any remaining questions from the panelists? For one thing, we have just a couple minutes left, so I think we're good. So I guess instead of starting a discussion that we won't be able to finish, I'd like to thank the presenters and the discussants for a really, really good sessions. I really appreciate all the work that went into this. So thank you very much, everybody. Again, Happy New Year. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully we can do this live next year.
Thank you all. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for organizing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.